Whenever Halloween rolls around, we have those handful of movies we must watch. Yes, of course, everyone needs to give John Carpenter's Halloween or Mike Doherty's Trick or Treat the annual viewing, but most of us have special flicks that only we know require a mandatory October watch. For this winter, one of those movies is Tales from the Crypt, the truly creepy feature film of 1972 made by Amicus Productions, known for their British anthologies like Torture Garden and The House That Dripped Blood. Tales from the Crypt is easily the best film in their filmography and a must-see for any current fan of horror anthology. Sure, everyone is familiar with the classic HBO series with the same title, but the movie is absolutely one of the best horror movies you never saw. Perhaps it's when we see those movies that decides just how loyal we'll be to them. For myself, I was a wee lad when my father, yes, thanks Dad, gifted me with a VHS of one of his favorite horror movies when he was a teenager. As a fan of horror comics, especially the re-releases of EC Comics in the 80s, the movie was a joy to behold, the first of its kind I'd ever seen. I'd only just begun my journey into the horror genre at that time, and it would be flat out crazy for me to not consider Tales from the Crypt a formative experience. Just a quick note, this was a tad before the HBO series came into existence, so this writer's experience with Tales from the Crypt started with the comics and the OG film. When the series premiered in 1989, it was a done deal. I was a horror hound for life, and I've got these bizarre, over-the-top tales of monsters and mayhem to thank. Drawing inspiration from the 1950s comic series of the same name, the ones that drove kids wild and their parents mad, the film organizes a quintet of horror stories revolving around the familiar Tales from the Crypt themes. Vengeance, just desserts, death usually meted out by supernatural forces, or sometimes just good old-fashioned human ingenuity. 2 of the 5 stories here have no supernatural overtones at all, but they're just as unnerving as their counterparts. And of course, an anthology of this kind wouldn't be the same without a wraparound story that brings all of our protagonists, or perhaps more accurately, antagonists, together in the same place to learn how their dastardly deeds led them to gruesome fates. Almost always, these are cruel and unsympathetic people who deserve what they get, which leaves the audience in a comfortable place of being entertained by these miscreants while knowing full well they'll get punished quite fittingly before long. In Tales from the Crypt, we meet 5 strangers who, for reasons they cannot explain, decide to join a tour of an old catacomb somewhere in the UK. Finding themselves lost, this bunch encounters an ominous fellow in a shroud, the original Crypt Keeper, naturally. Wasting no time, the Crypt Keeper, played by the great theater actor Sir Ralph Richardson, goes about explaining to the group what each of them has been up to as of late and how their lives will come to ghastly ends. One by one, we see each person's future. Or maybe it's their past. The first story everybody likely knows, if only thanks to the HBO remake. And All Through the House follows a woman who's just murdered her husband, and as if cleaning up the mess isn't enough work, and really, she probably could have thought the crime through a little better, the woman gets word via the radio that an escaped mental patient in a Santa suit is stalking the neighborhood. And wouldn't you know it, he's just so happened to set his sights on her house. Maybe there's such a thing as karma after all. What follows is an intense look at a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She's got a corpse to deal with, a maniac roaming outside the house, and a young daughter sleeping upstairs. A daughter who's really stoked about Santa Claus, by the way.
He's here, Mummy! I let him in! It's Santa!
This is one of those self-contained horror stories that works like gangbusters because you can put yourselves in the hero or anti-hero's shoes. How would you handle a situation like this as problems mount inside and out? Joan Collins plays the harried woman about 10 years before she'd become a television superstar thanks to Dynasty, and it's a great performance considering how little we know about her, how much we initially despise her, and then how much we somehow get on her side as she tries to avert disaster. Years later, All Through the House would be one of the 3 Tales from the Crypt episodes debuted by HBO in the summer of '89, directed by none other than Robert Zemeckis and penned by Fred Decker.
Merry Christmas, you son of a bitch.
The second story, Reflection of Death, is a fairly short but gripping tale, this time focusing on another character who we need not like right off the bat. A man named Carl who decides to leave his wife and children in order to run away with his mistress. All well and good until they get into a car accident which apparently leaves him thrown yards away from the car. The rest of the segment is seen through his eyes as the people he encounters recoil in terror at his visage. When he finally makes it back to his mistress's home, it dawns on him that a lot of time has actually passed since the accident, perhaps a reason he's not looking so hot. Reflection of Death isn't necessarily going to be the standout for most who watch Tales from the Crypt, but there's no denying it gets the job done in an efficient amount of time, is cleverly directed, and has an ending that makes the short but nasty trip worth it. Next up is probably the most well-regarded of the anthology, no doubt thanks to two memorable characters and the performances that give them life and death. In Poetic Justice, a kindly old widower in a posh suburban village finds himself the target of a snobby neighbor who's grown sick of the old man's shabby appearance and house. Grimsdyke, as played by the excellent horror vet Peter Cushing, is a friend to lonely animals and kids, but he's just not up to the standards of the priggish James Elliott, played brilliantly by stage actor Robin Phillips, who sports one of the most punchable faces you will ever find in a movie like this. I'm sure he was a real nice guy in real life, though. James's campaign against Grimsdyke is so overwhelmingly cruel that it's hard to take. You almost want to fast forward to the end so you can see the sneering little prick get what's coming to him, and you'd better believe that he does, although even a horrible death seems too good for him. The next tale takes a cue from one of the classic horror short stories, W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey Paw, though you certainly don't need to be familiar with that text to enjoy this skin-crawling nightmare. In the appropriately titled Wish You Were Here, a ruthless businessman tries to do everything he can to avoid bankruptcy after years of shady dealings and practices have brought him to this point. Offhandedly, his wife makes a wish upon one of the many exotic figurines they own, this one apparently capable of granting 3 wishes to its owner. As anyone who's seen Wishmaster or any Leprechaun movie already knows, or hell, any horror movie where some poor schmuck wishes for something, you should always be careful what you wish for, especially when the chances of said wish backfiring are quite high. So it just goes that our businessman buys the farm, hence giving his wife a ton of insurance money, but when she wishes to bring him back to life, well, let's just say you really ought to think these things through. Wish You Were Here, not unlike Reflection of Death, is on the shorter side and features a not very likable main character, but its ending is a delight for fans of abrupt horror and gore, not to mention finales where gruesome justice is delivered to deserving parties.
You wished him alive forever. You can't kill him. Every piece of him is alive still.
Plus, the music in these final moments is just great. And now would be a good time to mention the overall score by Douglas Gamley is thoroughly enjoyable in its notes of fear, madness, and terror. Finally, Tales from the Crypt wraps it up with Blind Alleys. If James in Poetic Justice is the most loathsome of the movie's characters, Major Rogers comes in a close second. A military veteran who takes over a home that caters to elderly blind men, Rogers brings a steel fist and unsympathetic attitude to his new job, depriving the patients of adequate heat and food, all the while enjoying the finest wines and primo steak that he shares with his trusty dog, Shane. When one of the patients dies due to neglect, that's the final straw for the rest of the home's residents, who decide to discharge Major Rogers in a most sinister way. Believability goes out the door on this one, especially when considering the ending, but who cares? You're watching Tales from the Crypt, and what this episode does best is present a villain who is thoroughly detestable from the start. Nigel Patrick gives a performance dripping with condescension and malice, while his opponent, played by the great British thespian Patrick Magee, is a wholly sympathetic figure. That is, until he's pushed to his breaking point. While the ending doesn't make a ton of logical sense, like seriously guys, there's gotta be an easier way to exact vengeance. You can't deny it presents us with some memorable visuals and a rather freaky scenario. Of course, once the tales are told, we're brought back to our crypt and our genial host informs this unlucky bunch that, as it turns out, these aren't things they're going to do, they're things they've already done. And, well, there's only one way you can leave the crypt, and you better believe it's not up. While not filled with the kind of gore and shocks we're used to seeing today, Tales from the Crypt was still a ghastly item for its time, and you can't deny the very British atmosphere adds to the overall aesthetic. The film was directed by Freddie Francis, who had a colorful career directing horror movies like this one, as well as acting as cinematographer on many acclaimed films such as Dune, Cape Fear, and Glory, the latter winning him an Oscar. Francis had a brilliant visual mind, and it shows in Tales from the Crypt, which is a terrific study in how to make B-movie material look regal while still honoring its lurid, bloody roots. If you enjoy short horror stories told effectively and with little mincing around, Tales from the Crypt will please you down to your bloody innards. And for a double dose of British horror, pair it with Vault of Horror, which was released a year later and was inspired by the same sick comics. Just don't let your folks know you're warping your mind with such things.